you ready?
I am ready to go if you're
Okay,
ready.
we want to welcome everyone that's online. We want to welcome everyone who may be watching and thank everyone who's in the room. We have Brian Giannini,
There you go.
oh my gosh, Upton here for school board candidate. And you have this hour to speak. You can have questions asked in the group. You can just speak if you want to speak, and I will answer. I'll let you know any questions that are online. Okay?
Great.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you for having us in tonight. I so appreciate it. And everything you do here at Island Books. Island Books, it's been said before, is an institution in Mercer Island. I know that you do incredible work in supporting our community-based organizations, especially our schools. I've done many bookathons here as a PTA volunteer and leader, so thank you for that through the years and all of your support. I thought I would start with, I have a lot of family here tonight, and so I'll start with a little bit of background of who I am and kind of where I come from to set that up, and then we'll move to some questions. So I was originally born in Cheyenne, Wyoming. I grew up there in a high-performing school district and graduated from a high-performing school, Cheyenne Central High School. A lot of the pressures that we feel here in Mercer Island School District were similar there in Cheyenne Central. I, however, had kind of a rough time in school. There was some trauma when I was a kid that I had to navigate through over a period of many years. And I didn't have a lot of academic guidance. Somehow my sister got connected to the right folks and really kind of sailed through. I did not. And so I've said this before, if I had been caught in a pandemic when I was in high school, I would have been lost. I would have fallen through the cracks, there's no doubt. And so that's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about the work that I do. So from Cheyenne, I grew up predominantly in theater. I did a ton of theater. That was my tribe of people. Music classes, dance, performing arts. And so I knew that's what I wanted to do when I left high school. So my first job out of high school, I worked for the local community college. I was an instructional aide at the Adult Learning Center, where I helped adults getting their GEDs and completing those things. And I generally helped the teachers track test scores and compiled educational materials, and occasionally even help students with math and different things like that. I also tied in with the Wyoming Opportunities for Work program during that, which was a public service program where students receiving public funds, as long as they were going for their GED, they had additional supports that went with that. So I would help them to track that progress as they went through. What I didn't realize at the time is by taking that job out of high school, it provided me a scholarship to Laramie County Community College. So I didn't have to pay tuition there. I just had to pay for books. So I signed up some courses there. And then after that, was convinced to go to the University of Wyoming. So I went to the University of Wyoming for a year. By default, I entered as an education major. I'll be honest, I was really interested in the Performing Arts Center, which was awesome, state of the art. And so I spent most of my time there. I probably won't surprise anyone that I was heavily involved with the Residence Hall Association. I was the president of my floor, the vice president of the Residence Hall Association, and I was a senator in the Associated Students of the University of Wyoming. And that's where I began to cut my teeth in parliamentary procedure and Robert's Rules of Order. So I was really involved there and got a chance to audition for a repertory theater over the summer after that first year. So my classwork was shaky. Again, I still wasn't a phenomenal academic, but I got some great courses, interpersonal communication and basic civics courses, social studies, archaeology, biology, those things. But really the money was running out. I didn't have the money for it. I was no longer getting tuition paid, like I was with the community college. And I was really had to face this choice of what I was going to do and how I was going to return for a second year at the university. So I went to Nebraska. I worked with Theater West Repertory. We did, I think, 6 shows over 3 months there. I got to meet some professors, talked with them about what should I do? Should I continue? And they said, we don't want to talk you out of pursuing academics. It's important. But if you really want to pursue performing, you really kind of had some chops. You could pursue this now. And at that point, I'd been performing for about 11 years. I started when I was 9 years old on stage. And so that's what I did. I went home. I got a job waiting tables, which is what many artists do. We're very good at waiting tables, especially in the theater, and did some local work, and eventually got some work, dinner theater work in Fort Collins, Colorado, made the move there. So I worked for a couple of years in dinner theater, which, let me tell you, waiting tables and performing 2 acts of a musical, that is a real job. And then from there, I moved into Denver, Colorado. I had a chance to work with a large union house in the show Gypsy. So I picked up and I moved there and centered in with the Arvada Center for the Performing Arts. While I was performing Gypsy, I caught a day show of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, and it blew my socks off. So one of the in-house companies at the Arvada Center is their children's company that works year-round, very consistently. And I said, how do I become a member of that group? And figured out how to do that. And so for the next several years, I was a regular with the Arvada Center for the Arts and Humanities doing theater for young audiences. So Roald Dahl and Charlotte's Web and all these great performances. I originally thought I wanted to be a classical actor, but once you presented me with dragons and knights and towers and kingdoms, I was sold, and I got to be a big giant. I really love the performing arts. The chance to use your imagination and to play, to tell stories that really move people. There's something really special that happens in a darkened theater with a great company of performers and an audience of 50 or 100 or 1,000 people, and emotionally how you connect within that space. Incredibly powerful to me. What I didn't realize through all of this is that it sharpened one of the sharpest tools in my toolbox, and that's my memory. In order to do theater and to be a performer, on a regular basis, you're handed these massive scripts, music scores, choreography, dialogue. And it's not enough just to memorize the dialogue and the lyrics and the choreography, but you have to get a sense for the rhythm and the arc and the emotion of the piece. You really have to understand a story being told in a really deep way. Now I know in education, this is called deep learning. To be able to take a really large piece of information, to break it down into small bites or French scenes, to digest those pieces and then be able to string them together, to retain all of that and to be able to pull emotion and a meaning from that, was a skill that I was building from the time I was 9 years old, all through my adulthood in that career, that I didn't even realize was going to have all of these other applications later in my life. So along with doing theater for young audiences, I also did a lot of fringe theater. There was Theater on Broadway, or theater group. They were the LGBTQIA2S+ community in Denver. If you were going to do Poor Superman or Love, Valor, Compassion, or The Band Plays On, Terrence McNally's Corpus Christi, any of these really meaty pieces that dealt with alternative lifestyles and transgendered questions and same-sex marriage, and at time it was really difficult to challenge that. Theater on Broadway was the group that did that. And so I worked with them a lot in their musical theater, but had a chance to do shows like Party and Corpus Christi. And I remember we were in opening weekend of a show there when we received news about what had happened to Andrew Shepard. So to be in that space surrounded by a company that was so centered in the community and a pillar of the community for the LGBTQ community, and to hear news of this young man who had been killed in Laramie, Wyoming, which of course is the home of the University of Wyoming, it hit really hard for me. And that was a really pivotal moment in my life. So working through that and continuing on, I continued to lean into those fringe pieces, something that either opened a window to our community or held a mirror up to it, where we could see ourselves reflected, that really challenged the audience to think in shows that would linger. And over time in Denver, I kind of became known as a designated batter. If you needed somebody, an actor, to step into a piece at the last minute to get very quickly up to speed and get rolling, I was one of those people that you could call. One of my philosophies, it's an improv theater philosophy, is when somebody makes a suggestion, you say yes and or yes let's. And if you're going to do theater and if you're going to make a living in theater, you say, yes, let's a lot, because you have to do many, many productions simultaneously while you're also designing and directing and painting and building and lighting. During that time, I also became the artistic director of Bluebird Productions, as well as Destiny Productions through the Oriental Theater. We were producing a new or original operetta based on classical works, essentially every 9 weeks. So operettas based around Joan of Arc or Moby Dick, or even some children's pieces. And I started there as an actor, became a choreographer and a designer, and eventually they asked me to take over as artistic director. It was during that period of my life I got a phone call from a friend working for the Lita Project, who was a very fringe theater company in Denver. And they needed an actor to step in and cover the role of Hedwig in The Angry Inch. Not many people even today are familiar with that, but 20 years ago, it was very unknown at the time. It's the story of a botched sex change escapee from communist East Berlin who has turned into an internationally ignored rock song stylist, is the official theme. It's an amazing show. It's based in kind of the David Bowie, Lou Reed glam punk rock scene, and tells this really interesting story of Hansel and how he became Hedwig and how she has come to find herself performing in Denver, Colorado on a winter's evening at the Climax Lounge in 5 Points. So during that production, amazing, that's the crown jewel production in my resume. But during that production, a fan came in and got to know the show, liked the show because she was a fan and stuck around because I think she kind of began to like the lead actor in it. And we got talking and got to know each other. And soon we began dating, and that's Jennifer, that's my now wife. We were married 2 years from the date of our first kiss. It was a really great rock and roll romance from the very beginning. And so after 2 years, right as we were getting ready to be married, Jen had a job shift, which essentially said, either start looking for something or move to the Pacific Northwest, come out to Seattle. So we took a deep breath and we came out to Seattle, which was exciting and really scary. In theater, reputation precedes you. It takes a long time to build that reputation and to be known in a community. So to walk away from that and years of investment to start over again in the Pacific Northwest was really terrifying. But yes, let's. Yes, and. So we began a new chapter here in the Pacific Northwest. I connected with Theater Puget Sound, which has regional auditions. And I was engaged by a company called Open Door Theater. This was a company that works specifically with kids. And it educates, their line is they educate children about abuse and violence by teaching personal safety skills through dramatic live performances. They were established by a group of prosecuting attorneys who, instead of dealing with court cases of child abuse, they wanted to get upstream of it and figure out what were the root causes of this, where it was coming from. They were also fans of theater, and they said, there's a power when actors talk to an audience and engage with them that's different than a police officer delivering a lecture or an attorney delivering a lecture at a school. If we could put actors providing situations in front of the schools and combine those with safety steps that the kids could learn and repeat, that we could maybe be doing a service here. So that was, without a doubt, the most grueling, heartbreaking, difficult, and rewarding job I've ever done in my life. We were trained specifically around ACEs and preventative care. We were taught how to look for red flags. We were always watching and observing the audience for that. We were trained by police officers and investigators and attorneys, both prosecuting attorneys and defense attorneys, specifically what to say or what not to say in these cases, because sometimes as actors, a troop of 4 going into a school, you would receive a disclosure from someone, and you had to know how to respond to that what to say, specifically what not to say, how to retain that information and get them to a trusted counselor teacher who could then report that and start the process. And I worked with that company for 4 years. Every year it was a big decision. Do I want to go back? It was rewarding knowing I was making a difference. At the time, I also knew what the statistics were, is that 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys would experience sexual assault or harassment by the time they reached 18 years old. In the time since I worked with Open Door Theater, that number has not shifted that much. That has informed the work that I do around advocating for victims, advocating for kindness, advocating for social and emotional learning. So I was working with that company. My 4th year, I eventually worked up from directing shows to, they asked me to step in as the artistic director of the company, and I took over the position of artistic director with the caveat that at that point, Jen and I had decided it was time to start a family. We want to start a family, and that if Jen became pregnant, that I would step down from my post to become a stay-at-home dad, which is what happened. So my daughter Wilder came into the scene, and just weeks before she was born, I resigned as artistic director of Open Door Theater and became a full-time stay-at-home dad. There's another area where theater really served me because I was very consistent and well-trained in how to reset the stage for the next performance, multiple performances a day. And that was very much taking care of a little one, tummy time and all. So we're getting to the end of the story, I promise, the end of the arc. So she was, when she was 3 years old, we knew we had been watching across the water, across the lake, to this rock in the middle of the lake, Mercer Island School District, Mercer Island City. And we had heard amazing things about the school district. And we said, you know, if there's a chance we can do it, if there's a chance we can get there, we should. And so we did. And about 10 years ago, we did everything we could, and we made an offer, and we got a house in Mercer Island, and we moved here. And when Wilder started kindergarten, well, in preschool, she attended preschool here in Mercer Island and Montessori. And I actually was able to step in on occasion to help out there when needed, an amazing group of people. And when she entered kindergarten, I went to the PTA coffee because that's what I was supposed to do. And I've learned that be prepared if you go to the PTA coffee at the beginning of the year, because there's so many opportunities to volunteer and there's so many positions that need to be filled. So I kind of carelessly went through the gym and said, oh, sure, room parent, okay, an art docent, and I can volunteer for that. Oh, in science fair. And so I became room parent with a couple of other fantastic room parents, and organizing parties and organizing the class and getting information out, and it was amazing, and very quickly became nominated as the president-elect of our local unit at West Mercer. I served as a year as the president-elect and then a year as the president of the Mercer Island PTSA. Amazing work, all of the work that went into understanding what that job is, how it functions. And there was a burning question in there when we started in kindergarten. We were asked by all these organizations to give money, $500 for this group and $270 for that group. And I said, well, how does, here's the big question, how does public education funding work? Why am I being asked for this money, and where does this money come from? I'm known to drop into rabbit holes on occasion, go wandering into the weeds, and I'm still in that rabbit hole and wandering in those weeds, trying to figure out public education funding and how that happens. But eventually grew through that, leaned into Washington State PTA and the training around being an advocate there, building the legislative platform. I served as a delegate, I think 3 or 4 years, to the Washington State legislative meeting, where the legislative positions were set every 2 years on the biennium and then reaffirmed in between. And during that period, as president of the PTA and serving on the CMIPS, which is the Committee for Mercer Island Public Schools, which helped to run the levy campaigns, somebody suggested that I start sitting in on school board meetings. And I noticed in school board meetings, there was a lot of talk about the Schools Foundation, which is an amazing group. There was a lot of talk about the boosters, which are amazing groups. There wasn't a lot of talk happening about PTA. So I bought myself some blue polos with the PTA logo on it, and I began sitting in on every school board meeting. And for the longest time, it was me and it was President Schaefer of the Mercer Island Education Association. And many times it was just the two of us sitting in there, not Mr. Schaefer, actually that was Mike Wright at the time, was the president. And it was the two of us sitting in all those meetings. So I followed and attended the board meetings for a year and a half, and leaned into their process of superintendent succession planning when that was happening. I think I attended all but maybe one or two meetings when they selected the past superintendent, every meeting that was open to the public. And got to wait, and I was kind of a fixture there. I was there when they selected the search firm. They would even bring me documents because they knew I wanted a copy of the documents. And then a position became open on the board, and I said, you know what, let's do it. Some folks approached me. So I threw my hat in the ring and I ran. So for the last 4 years, I didn't stop there. I immediately became the legislative representative on the board. It's the board elects that position along with vice president and president. The legislative representative is the conduit and liaison to the Washington State School Directors Association and the legislative general assembly that happens there and the delegates assembly. I was the delegate. I became connected with the Federal Relations Network, which is through the National School Boards Association, and actually reconnected our school district with the National School Boards Association, NSBA. When we connected, they said, the last person we have on file is this individual. Do you know them? I said, I don't. When we checked, that person hadn't worked in the school district for 10 or 15 years. So it'd been a really long time since somebody on the board, somebody from Mercer Island, really ventured off the island and began telling the island's story. A lot of people think they know Mercer Island and know about Mercer Island. And what I hear time and again from representatives is that we need more islanders out there serving on panels telling Mercer Island's story, because it's not what people think it is. In my second year on the board, I served as president of the board and then returned to legislative representative. I just stepped down in April as legislative representative for my third term when I filed for re-election because there's a lot of work and crossover with our community-based organizations, and sometimes that can be tricky with political candidates, and so I stepped down. So for the first time in 3.5 years, I'm officially a board director without being a legislative representative on the executive team or a president or something like that. Also, when Lisa Callan stepped out of her school board role when she was elected to the State House of Representatives, some folks tapped me on the shoulder and said, her seat is vacant and it's in your director area. Have you considered running for the legislative committee for the Washington State School Directors Association? And I said, yes, let's. So I ran and was elected there. So I'm now in my second term. I've served for 3 years on the legislative committee. It's a group of 24 individuals representing the 295 school districts across Washington State that builds the legislative platform for the WASDA, which is the State School Directors Association, and really implements that, advocates, heads to Olympia, takes meeting, testifies in House panels, and really supports the 1.2 million students across Washington State. And that has been my full-on work. As my daughter has grown through the school district and has become more and more independent, we are now on the precipice of the teen years, which are not going to be a problem at all. But I'm, of course, am needed less and less there. I'm always needed there as a dad, and mom is always needed. But I've had more and more time to dedicate and volunteer into our school district. And so that brings us to today. That's the very long story, but because I didn't have to answer that in 60 seconds or 30 seconds, I thought I would share that with you. So with that, I want to open it up for questions. If you have questions about my platform or philosophies, my approach to things, if you're curious, please ask away. My family is here tonight, so there may not be a lot of questions from the room, but when it comes to public education, there are always questions. So please ask away.
We don't have anything on the chat right now. So is there anything in the room right now? Carol?
Uh, I've heard a lot of concern from parents that focus around AP classes
Mhm.
and the concerns about if you don't have AP classes, how's this going to look to the Ivy Leagues? And what's the truth of the AP class situation?
What's the truth of the AP class situation? I think AP courses, honors courses, I have a niece who's in the International Baccalaureate program. There are all these courses. There's also Running Start, there's dual credit, there's all these opportunities. So depending on the path that you want to take, depending on the universities or colleges that you want to apply to, you're going to receive different information from different counselors as to how important those are. I know some AP courses or some universities, colleges are relying less on that, but others are sticking with it. I think if you're a student who is accelerating at a pace that's appropriate for you, and you're heading into those big classes, those AP courses, I think it's fantastic. I think you should go for it, especially because those are dual credit courses. If you can take a course at the high school that can also count towards your college degree or university degree, that's fantastic. Equally, if you think you might want to try it, but you're not sure, you're a little scared that it's going to be too much for you, and you have the space and the credits to put down, that chip down on, I say go for it, take that risk. And take there's an option where it's a pass, no pass, or whatever that is, but maybe that sets you up for when you do take that course at a university or college. So AP courses, honors courses play a really important role. I think it really depends on the student's trajectory and the family's trajectory. That's very much a personal family decision and student decision on how you're going to do that and accelerate. AP courses, honors courses aren't going anywhere. They're a part of Mercer Island School District. They're available because of our local levies. Our educational enhancement or enrichment levy is what it's officially called. We're able to offer things like a 7-period day at the high school. Many high schools only have 6 periods. When you have to have 24 credits in order to graduate from high school, you cannot afford to fail a course. But in Mercer Island School District, it's a 7-period day. So there are opportunities to take additional higher level courses, honors courses, AP courses, or to take a course that's maybe a risk, take a chance. And failure is a part of learning, and we've got to be able to take that risk. Or you can expand into those areas of curiosity or interest, whether it's the arts or literature, outside of one of those core courses. The other thing too is course equivalencies, which are areas of your life, work experience, apprenticeships that have a correlation to what's happening within a credit within that graduation and beyond in Washington State. Connecting those so students get credit for that work that's happening outside of the school is also really important. And then those dual credits. There's so much work happening around dual credit right now. But if I could alleviate everyone's pressure, nothing is happening with AP courses or honors courses. They're here. Another big question that's tied with that has to do with a highly capable program. And oftentimes students are identified through a high stakes assessment as to whether or not they qualify for the highly capable program, and then are placed into that. A study that was done, an audit that was done in Mercer Island School District back in 2017, 2018, indicated that these groups, highly capable, as well as what was happening with some of our cases of special education, specifically in remedial rooms and those services, these students were being really siloed and separate. It was just separate education. And we had students who might be receiving services for special education, who were also highly capable students, but because it was kind of an either or, you couldn't live in both spaces at the same time as a student. There was also concern from many people at the time, so students, educators, and teachers, and family members, parents, and community members were all surveyed in this and focus groups. And there was a real concern of a sense of elitism that was being formed around the highly capable program especially, but also the sense that if you were slapped with a special education label, if you were given a label because of an attribute, a characteristic or a circumstance, that you were being looked down on. So we have all these students that were walking around with all these labels. The recommendation from that audit was that the district begin moving towards inclusionary practices, which Washington State is moving towards inclusionary practices. It happens with budgeting and apportionment. And that really the crux of it, especially with special education, which I don't think is being talked about enough right now. In special education through IDEA and 504 programs, the requirement of the district is to provide those students with the services they need in the least restrictive setting. So if that service is portable and can be moved into their classroom, their general education classroom, as opposed to them having to leave the general education classroom, then the district should be doing that. Because when a student has to leave the general education classroom, that interrupts their schedule. They're losing really critical instructional time with their teacher and with their peers. So the more the services you move in. So the recommendation was that the district begin shifting these models into inclusionary practices. At the time, several different advisory groups were formed, parent advisory groups, and there was the highly capable advisory group that was formed that had parents and teachers and even students on that, that met a couple times a year that would go over and talk about assessments and what the plans would look like. And so we were told back then, I was just brand new on the board, fresh on the board, that in 5 years, special education services and highly capable services would likely look very different than they did back then. I'd say there hasn't been massive monumental change, but this last year, there was a shift. It was a go time for the district. And so the district pushed forward with that. And it was met with resistance, which was expected. And so the district continues to move forward, but trying to work in a way that still allows for people to bring their input, to weigh in, to really check with students and how this is impacting students' lives. But the highly capable program isn't going anywhere. The district will continue to participate with a highly capable program. Students will continue to be assessed and identified, as well as the programs for the younger grades. And students who qualify for that program will continue to receive services under that program that are compliant with OSPI, with the State Board of Education, and with the state law. So it's changing, and change is really scary, but those services are going to be there. For me, what's happening around special education, where these students with 504s and IEPs who have spent time out of the classroom with their peers are going to be a part of that integrated classroom. They're going to be in their neighborhoods instead of having to move to a different school outside of their neighborhood. So they're going to be able to hang out in their classes and in the halls in their home school, along with the very same kids that they play with in the neighborhoods on the weekends and the summers. And for me, that is incredibly important. For a student to be told that you are not your label, you are an individual. We see you as a whole person. We see you for your fears and your aspirations, your strengths and your weaknesses. We all have them and they play out in different ways. And sometimes those flip-flops, sometimes our weaknesses play out and become our strengths in other situations, and vice versa. That strengths can be a weakness. For me, to see the district moving in this really meaningful way is important. Being an emerging LGBTQ student in Cheyenne, Wyoming, in middle school and high school during the AIDS epidemic, and not really understanding what that meant for me, and the terror of that label being on me was devastating psychologically. I'm so proud of our district and our students and our community for building affinity groups and pockets where students can share their lives with each other in an authentic and meaningful way and can drop the labels and just be who they are. We're moving away from students having to assimilate into a dominant culture in order to be seen as successful, because that's just so damaging. And the studies that are coming out support that. That was a really long answer for that, but clearly I'm passionate about that. So we can talk more, but I want to provide opportunity for questions. And you can tell me at any time.
Absolutely.
Hey.
I will, don't worry. I have one.
Yes.
And it's random. I don't even, given the last year and a half,
Mhm.
what do you think the board did well during COVID? And what do you think they did poorly and could have improved on? I know it was a hard time. It was hard for parents.
Yeah.
It seemed like a shit show. I'll be really honest. I have lots of friends who are teachers. It felt like a shit show to them.
Yeah.
What do you think as a board you could have done better? If you were ever in that situation again, what will you do?
That's such a hard question. It's hard to think about that because we're still in it. So early on in the pandemic, and we were in a really interesting place in Mercer Island because our neighbors here, we're the itty bitty in the bunch. We're surrounded by districts like Seattle with 50,000 students and 40,000 or more in Lake Washington. And we're these massive, and Bellevue, these massive school districts. And then there's us with our just over 4,000 students. And over 75% of our staff comes from off island. So everything in the United States really kind of hit around North Shore School District. That's where we began to see the first reports of COVID showing up. First big concerns started showing up, and we began to learn through our superintendent and regular communication with superintendent. As a board, I began to learn through those regular conversations that things were shaky. We weren't sure what was going to happen. And fairly quickly, North Shore announced, we're going to have to close our doors. And they had the infection there. Like it was, the community was panicked. Not very long after that, Seattle said, we can't do it. We're going to close our doors. And really, Seattle is the Goliath. It's the largest school district in the state. And because they're our neighbors, when they shut their doors, it had this huge impact to all of our school districts. There weren't employees anymore. People had to stay home, just like everyone, with their kids. And so everybody began shutting down. I think that from early reports, I sense that the administration wanted to stay open a little bit longer, just however many days they could before they had to close those doors. But once it happened, I remember saying to a friend, public education as you know it has just closed its doors and has changed. And it's going to need time to figure out what it's going to do and pivot when it reopens. What came pretty loud across from our board president at the time and agreed to by the Board of the Administration was that we were going to focus on students who were the furthest from educational equity. We were going to try to figure out first and foremost how those students who were most at risk and most impacted were going to be connected and caught. And for me, that was really important because as I said at the beginning, if the pandemic had hit when I was a student, I would have been lost. I would not have graduated from high school. And that was the effort. And then it really became about the governor's mandates and when we had to be reopened, ready or not, you had to have an online option. And then of course, everybody had an idea of what needed to happen or wouldn't happen, shouldn't happen. And so the district put together learning forward teams at each of the facilities. So there were parents and educators and administrators who began meeting on Zoom, trying to figure out what that was going to look like. And then we just became forming this network across the state, connecting to OSPI and public health and our other board directors across the state. A group of 10 of us here in the region, we call ourselves the Eastside King County Work Group, began meeting every Friday morning. And we've been meeting since March of 2019, every morning, every Friday morning. And it's North Shore, Bellevue, Issaquah, Lake Washington, and Mercer Island, the
You meet in
babies.
person?
Over Zoom. We've not yet met in person. We had one meet and greet where we all got together briefly and saw each other. Sometimes, for some of us, it was the first time we'd ever met. But these are leaders within WASDA, leaders within NSBA. And we began comparing notes. This is what I'm hearing folks saying, what is actually happening in your school district? That worked really, really well. For us, I know the superintendents connected very quickly as to understanding what was happening in our region. Because in the case of this crisis, we're not alone. We're very much dependent on each other because we share employees, we share resources, we share all of this. And then we were connected through Washington State School Directors Association. The legislative committee typically met every Thursday to talk about our interim practices and what we're going to do. That was already a video meeting. And that became a statewide meeting for the Washington State School Directors Association. It became the COVID networking call. And soon we had senators and representatives on that call and other educational groups that were leaning in, where we were sharing out information. The governor has just released this information. Our policy and legal team, here's their interpretation of that. Here are resources. Here's some model policies that you can look at. And so we became incredibly connected as a network. We always said that your first year of being a school board director was like drinking from a fire hose. Well, add 5 fire hoses together, and that's being a school board director in a pandemic. What the district could have done better, I think communications was a struggle. How do you communicate something that you know is going to change most likely in 48 to 72 hours? And especially with a community that is panicked. It became really difficult, and for a small district. But that could have been better, absolutely. And I think, well, I can only speak for myself. Our communication absolutely could have been better. I think the support of our staff, the professional development, there was so much that went into it, but I think there were teachers who struggled to get connected. And we talk a lot in education about the experience factor. So you have first year teachers who are fresh out of university, who are amazing and have all this fresh technology information, and they're ready to go. And then you have these 20, 25-year-old teachers who've been in the district who have a master's degree plus 90 hours, the equivalent of a PhD, who are amazing master teachers. And so you have the master teachers who knew how to engage students, assess them, make goals, and to plan for that, really agile, but weren't good with technology. That was just not going to work. And then we had these really great technology-driven young people in the district who had that down, but really their pedagogy hadn't been defined at that level yet. They were still building that muscle. The pro from that is the professional learning communities that built were pretty amazing. I think just the struggle of getting those resources of professional development to them and connecting was the hard part. And then the most difficult thing, I think, for everyone was moving forward at the speed of trust. People wanted the district open. People wanted the district closed. We had staff that were terrified. We had families that were terrified. We had students that were terrified. You could only move forward at a pace where you had enough people engaged and willing to participate to make it work. And I began using a seesaw analogy early on, where on one side you have the students who show up, who say, I want to participate. That then triggers the apportionment of the funds, which then you can go and hire your staff. If you don't have the students, then you can't get the apportionment and you can't hire the staff. You can have the apportionment and the staff, but the students aren't there, it's not going to happen. But if you have the students and the apportionment and the staff is unwilling to show up because they're terrified and fearful for their lives, then that's not going to work. And so the MOUs, and that's deeply operational, and those bargains happen with the associations and the represented employees. And that was all about the impacts on their work that had to be negotiated before we could move forward. It was a tug of war.
Yes. I have a
Yes.
follow-up question on that. 2 parts, both the pandemic and it's a good segue with the MOU with the MIEA and the teachers union. So at the state level, eventually there was a mandate that all public employees and teachers be vaccinated. I felt personally that the district should have taken initiative because of what they are district employees to do it earlier. 1, do you agree that the state mandate was correct? 2, do you think the district, with respect to their own employees, should have taken the initiative?
Okay, that's a good question.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes,
Sorry.
with vaccinations for staff members. Did I agree with moving them up in the queue?
No, did you agree with the state mandate that teachers be vaccinated? Now with respect to their priority.
Oh, the current mandate of
Yes.
vaccine. So which just passed the deadline. Did I agree with that? Yes, I agree with that.
The second, do you think the district should have acted prior to waiting for the state to act?
On a vaccine mandate for
Correct.
employees?
For its employees?
No, absolutely not.
Why?
Because it's a legality issue. In all of these choices, there's guidance that is provided by public health, the CDC, Washington Department of Health, King County Public Health. There are government mandates and laws that are put through. These recommendations, they're not guidance, they're not requirements, but they are very strong recommendations. If you're not in alignment with the recommendations that are coming from these organizations, your insurance carrier may not choose to support you in the case of a lawsuit. So if you have an infection, you have a lawsuit where there's a loss of life, if you have an incident that comes up and your insurance carrier, your risk pool says you weren't in alignment with the guidance that was provided, we're not going to provide you, then those dollars come out of our general fund. There is no fund of money to provide that. So the issue is, and in every step along the way with this virus and all these steps in mitigation of virus and all of that, the reason it's had to be in alignment with state and federal and county guidance around that is because it is absolutely an insurance risk.
To be clear, there was no guidance that prohibited districts from requiring their employees to be vaccinated. So your position is that it would have exposed the district, barring any conflict in guidance, that it would have increased insurance premiums due to taking the initiative. Is that correct?
I didn't say that it would necessarily increase insurance premiums. I said it's a risk that you have to weigh, and you have to weigh it against the pool. Like I said, 75% of our employees come from off island. If you don't have the employees to work in your school district, you can't open classrooms. And I think we can look at some of our surrounding districts to see how that played out when the represented employees just hit the wall with the administration. You can only move forward at the speed of trust. I think we're very fortunate that once everything was moved and was opened up for teachers to get vaccinated, Mercer Island School District worked with community-based organizations to very quickly make those vaccines affordable, available, well, not affordable, they were provided free, make them available to provide the time off if an appointment came up where an educator or a staff member could get that vaccine. And very quickly, we were topping out a vaccine. We had extraordinary participation in vaccinations, as well as with our students. I would say early on, I was one of the few people who held out on moving the queue up, and it was controversial at the time. As to whether teachers as a whole should be able to move forward in the queue. And the reason I oppose that is it would have put that class of people ahead of students of ours who are 16 to 19 years old with 2 or more comorbidities. At-risk students who would have had to wait longer so that healthy adults could get the vaccine. And that was a bit controversial, but like with everything, when that decision was made, when the WASDA board decided that, and WASDA, and we called them the alphabet soup, the organization said, we're moving forward with that queue, I got behind it and said, the decision's been made and we're gonna do that. And then they opened it up for everyone, and very quickly our community responded. But you've got to move forward at the speed of trust, and you have to take into account risk assessment, because there is no legal fund. Anytime there's litigation, anytime the district has to respond to that, those are education dollars. Those are dollars that would be otherwise spent on our students. And that's really important for the community to know. I don't know if they know that. All right. Other questions? I know we're coming up toward the end.
We are at 8:01. I have no questions online.
Okay. Carol.
Let's discuss the budget problem.
Mm-hmm. The budget problem. If there's one constant in public education, yes, it's change. Change is the one constant. So I have been involved with education leadership on the island through PTA, through a levy cliff that we had to mitigate through all of the McCleary changes and the 2 waves of funding that came around McCleary, and how that basically for Mercer Island broke even, came out a little bit ahead, took money from our local levy and put it back in basic education dollars. And we've watched the district fluctuate. We've watched opening a new school. There's always a budget crisis on Mercer Island. And for as long as I've been involved in leadership, there's always been a crisis. And that's not to take away from the situation that we're currently in. So there is a decline in student population, and we've known for some time that we're anticipating a decline in student population. It goes with birth rates in King County. Dr. Les Kendrick is the demographer that has done this for the district for a number of years. And he tracks it in part on birth rates in King County at a higher rate for Mercer Island, because many parents moved to Mercer Island, like our family did, after our child was born. And then there's the unknowables that were happening there. And then within 5 years or so, it's predicted and projected that we're going to be on the upswing of that. And it happens. There's the big boom generation, and then the children of their children, and then their children. So these waves happen. With the pandemic, parsing out what has happened with families of the students who left the district during the crux of the pandemic, 60% of those or more who were anticipated would come back actually moved off the island, out of the district, many off the state, many went back to a country of origin. Many families moved into private schools, which was a big decision to make. I've heard from some, but this is anecdotal at best, that they've disrupted their child by moving in there. Their child has found some balance and some equilibrium, which is incredibly important right now. So they're going to stick with it for now. And then there's those students who either became homeschooled or found another alternative option who it actually really worked out. I happen to know a student in particular who, while it was challenging to be remote, they are much an introvert like me. And so not having to deal with the hustle and bustle of the school was actually a benefit. There are other students who realized that they could accelerate at a pace that was much faster. And so for them, homeschooling or an alternative learning environment actually was incredibly beneficial. And we can't take away from our historically marginalized global majority students who are facing bullying, harassment, or intimidation in schools, or generally feeling unsafe. Many of those students are saying, and are continuing to say, I don't want to go back into the schools. I don't want to go back until I can feel safe. A lot of those are BIPOC students, so Black, Indigenous, people of color. We saw a huge spike in hate crimes against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Anti-Semitism is on the rise, which sparks groups like No Place for Hate, which was existing in our high schools at a time. LGBTQ students, transgender students. There are a lot of students who, for one reason or another, because of the label they've been given or because of the harassment or bullying, they felt really realized, no, I don't want to head back into that. So I think parsing out of that is going to be important. So that has an impact on the district. On average, students are not widgets and they're not dollar signs, but on average, it works out to around $12,500 per student. So if you have a loss of 100 students, that's significant. When you have a loss of 200 students, that's significant. While many of our students exited the island, there were other students that were moving in. So currently, with adjusted projections, and this was all offered at the last board meeting. If you're ever curious about it, the first hour of the board meeting is the superintendent's report. And this is all the juicy stuff is in there in that report. You don't have to stick with us for the full 5 hours, but if you give it that first hour or review that, which you can, there's a lot of information there. And they just went over all of that. The difference between full-time enrollment, which is adding all of the partial enrollments into FTE, which triggers the apportionment from the state. And then there's the actual head count. So currently we're only down about 60 students from projected head count, which was adjusted with the pandemic, which is really tricky. So yeah, our budget is shrinking because of that. We knew the budget was shrinking. Fortunately, Mercer Island School District, the administration has an amazing relationship with MIEA, which represents not only educators, but paraeducators, custodians, bus drivers, many represented groups in there, as well as our other technical experts, our administrative assistants, and our facility administrators. There's a really great working relationship in there, and there's so much space to flex the style and the budget in a way that is going to accommodate. This is what schools do and what public education does. It's going to take time to build back the fund balance that we had. The board as a whole decided to protect the fund balance at 8% with a 10% top for the first time. That's roughly 2 months operating revenue, which is pretty tight. Many people said, no, it should be 4% or 5%. It was a rainy day fund. When the rainy day came, the administration recommended that we spend the funds, and the school board agreed. The majority of the school board agreed with that decision and moved forward. That being told, our first numbers for actual FTE enrollment have just been released in October. This will be used to tell us about apportionment, the first chunk of that'll happen in November. And in November is when the district, along with the board, begins the work of building the budget for the next year. By the time we get to the public hearing on the budget at the end of August, which is required by law, all of this work has gone into that to set a budget. And the budget is not the bank account. That's not the fund, what's in there. The budget is a suggested projection of what we expect to spend and what we expect to receive in apportionment. And if you can get that lined in where it hits on that zero line perfect, good for you. Keep in mind also, this is the fund balance we're talking about. There are other budgets. There's the transportation budget, the technology budget, the associated student body budget, the capital budget. Those are restricted buckets of money that are untouched and are incredibly stable. Well, transportation it continues to be a problem, but the transportation fund specifically is what is used to maintain our bus fleet. And there's some really exciting things happening there while we're dealing with this inside of the general fund. With transportation, the board has directed the superintendent and administration to present a report on what it would take in a plan to, over the next 10 years or so, convert the entire fleet in Mercer Island School District to electric buses. And the requirements of capital infrastructure required from the capital budget in order to create the hubs to charge those buses, which is really exciting. And that came from community feedback. Community members said, this action isn't happening, we want you to do it. And the board explored it, decided not to put the transportation levy on this go around, but to give it to the end of the year to have a long-term transportation plan in place, which is really exciting. So there's really great stuff happening as well. I'm not going to call Chicken Little. I think people should always be concerned about the budget and finances. I don't think it's as dire as it's being projected at the moment in a political season.
Thank you.
I'll phrase it that way. I know we're right up at the wall here. Are there any other questions or online?
I know,
Okay.
I don't have anything online. They're very quiet.
Well, I want to thank my family for being here. Thank you for hosting this. It's so important. Carol, you've been amazing. I see myself in you in showing up for all of these and being the in-person representation of the public. It takes a lot. Thank you for saying yes, let's, and being here with us. In closing, when I worked with PTA, there was a sign off that PTA used. The logo, the registered trademark of National PTA, and I'm going to clarify this is their registered trademark, is every child, one voice. And the regular sign off would be, thank you for helping us turn every child's potential into a reality. As a leader in PTA, I adopted those phrases. It was very meaningful to me. Every child, one voice, that's theirs. When I worked with the Washington State School Directors Association, they began working on their equity statement and specifically their racial equity statement. They identified educational equity and racial equity as creating a system wherein the outcomes for any child could not be predicted on their race, their characteristic, or their circumstance. And to make a dedication to look at our systems and to eliminate all forms of racism, bias, and any form of prejudice that arises. The board of directors for the Washington State School Directors Association gets the credit for formulating that statement. I'm very proud to be part of the team on the legislative committee that took that and put it forward as part of the permanent position and belief philosophy of the Washington State School Directors Association. And I have personally taken that on myself, and my signatures you will often see is saying thank you for your partnership and ensuring that every child, regardless of race, characteristic, or circumstance, has the resources and supports that they need and have a right to in creating their future. I thank you for your partnership. I ask for your vote and support moving forward. And if you choose me to continue to represent, it is a privilege to serve this island and our community. It is an honor to represent you in all of these groups across the nation. I promise that I will continue to be a feet on the ground, learning advocate who always shows up early for the meeting and says, yes, let's, yes, and. Together, we're going to improve the lives. Thank you.